because talking of problems, there seems to be a few issues with the American president. One, Mr. Biden, no less, because he seems to be having more and more health concerns, does President Biden, and some of his sort of activities seem to be being restricted. So I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Tom Packer, who is a fellow of the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford, to discuss this further. Dr. Tom, thank you for being with us this afternoon on Tice Talk. So, President Joe Biden, he is, as we know, he's 80, and there have been a few concerns recently. But just the other week, he skipped a dinner at NATO, and then sort of you look at some of his mumbling and bumbling discussions, for example, with the president of Israel just the other day, and you think, I mean, what is going on here? What's happening to poor old Joe Biden?
He's slightly below 80, though. He's definitely getting close to getting there. I think it's always very hard to read these things. We all have our off days, particularly if we're in our late 70s. Previous presidents, when they've had very serious health problems, it's been largely concealed, so it's difficult to know what would be happening. I'm inclined to the view, for what it's worth, that he's a little frailer than he used to be, that he's losing it a bit. One thing I would emphasize is he's never been somebody who always says the correct thing. He's never been a Richard Tice communicator, I suppose you might say. He's always gone off on weird tangents and made insane factual errors. So one wouldn't necessarily read too much into any kind of particular short expression when he's slightly incoherent. I think one has to judge it as a whole. What is striking is how much less active his schedule is than a usual president. Maybe not so different from Trump, but very different from all the previous presidents. This is clearly a president whose staff thinks, either he thinks or his staff thinks or his wife thinks, he can't afford to do the usual kind of the number of appearances a president does. And I think that's one reason his polling rating, while not horrific, is nothing to write home about.
And so essentially in press conferences, I mean, he's now, even with any meeting, I mean, you saw him there with the president of Israel recently, and he's got his little sort of crib sheet on his knee, and even just to make general comments, he's essentially having to read and prompt himself. I mean, which this is just being played there. You can see him there with the president of Israel. He either looks asleep or he's looking down at his notes, but it's not good. It's not encouraging and reassuring, is it?
Yeah, well, it depends on your perspective, where it's reassuring. I think from a conservative point of view, that probably is true, because I think Joe Biden is slightly more moderate than most of his subordinates are. But if you're a more strong progressive, you might see the opposite. It's good that he might have more deference to them. I would say he's generally, because of the British parliamentary system, senior British politicians get unusually used to speaking off the cuff. In America, it's quite normal to have crib sheets for things like that. What's unusual is that Joe Biden is doing so very blatantly, probably because he's tired. It's actually very normal for presidents to read off crib sheets at that kind of event.
But not even. But they're restricting him at press conferences. And then I read also that there's a change with regard to the steps, the number of steps on Air Force One, that they've reduced the number of steps, the whole ladder, in order to try and reduce the likelihood of him actually falling over, bless him.
Yeah, it's always hard to know with these stories whether they're accurate or not, but I can believe it. I have to say, at the risk of being an apologist for Joe Biden, I wouldn't particularly want to go up and down those steps very often. Well, it's really quite long. So well, I can see why, if you're in your late 70s,
the good news is, yeah, on the steps, they have now got some helpful guidance. I was talking about guidance earlier. There's some guidance on these steps that says, mind the step.
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously hundreds of people go off it. And actually, because he's escorted by the Secret Service at all points, he would be less likely to fall than other people, just because if he fell, they would catch him. So I wouldn't overread that. But this is obviously a president who lacks the energy we used to.
Do you think, Tom, in all seriousness, and there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, and I think he is actually 80, according to my producer, Aaron, who's just double-checked. But okay. Do you think that, I mean, there was the fairly meandering inspection of the Welsh Guards the other day with King Charles, and you just wonder, I mean, importantly, in the eyes of our opponents, whether it's what's going on in China, whether it's Russia. I mean, do they not just see him as weak and meandering and his deputies weak, and therefore they sort of think, frankly, the leader of the free world is weak?
I think there might be something in that, but I wouldn't exaggerate how much it's from his health issues. Like, it's not like Joe Biden would be, if the American army's unleashed, anyone would expect Joe Biden to be leading the attack. I think that might be the effect of some of his policies. He's very wary, a bit like Trump, actually. Interesting similarity between them. He's very wary of getting involved in fights, getting involved militarily. He's slightly cautious. He tends to like other people to like him. He's very, and this might partly reflect age, differential to the bureaucracy beneath him. But, at the same time, the United States is a very, very powerful country. And in some ways, of course, so for example, I think Mr. Putin thought the US wouldn't be able to do much to stop him going through Ukraine. And yes, obviously, the chief credit for that goes to Ukrainians, but the massive US and to a less degree other countries' military aid is absolutely crucial in preventing Russia winning. So it's not like one should just ignore the US as the major power.
But actually, just picking up what you've then said, if he's deferential to the advice he gets from his advisors, what you're really saying is actually it's his advisors in the Pentagon to the National Security Agency who've advised him to go down this route with Ukraine, for example, rather than his own strong judgment.
I mean, it's always difficult to read things from outside and everyone's spinning you. I kind of think it is him. He's been very involved in Ukrainian politics for a long time, actually, like nearly about 10 years now. He was very involved in some of the support for the revolution that overthrew the relatively pro-Russian president that existed 8 years ago and so forth. And I do think he has made his own mark on foreign policy. Probably most notably, now this is a very controversial thing, I think it is pretty clear it was Joe Biden's decision to completely withdraw from Afghanistan. Almost everyone below him wanted to stay in. And I think that's an example of the fact, yes, he probably is perhaps more than most presidents deferential to his advisors, but he does sometimes just make his own decisions and impose them. He is ultimately in charge.
But you touch on his involvement with Ukraine, but actually that's essentially part of the source of the controversy with his son, and whether or not there has been significant contracts and things in and around Ukraine. So that works both ways. I mean, there is all sorts of serious allegations against them as a family.
There are. I mean, I think one also has to differentiate. He's very clear Hunter Biden, to defend, even if once his biggest friend, had A, broken the law in various respects, and B, at the very least, been pushing the envelope in terms of getting aid from getting money as a consultant from various very dodgy oligarchs. I would say it's harder to link Joe Biden to them. There's some evidence, but it's mostly based on people saying Hunter Biden said X, where I'm not sure I'd necessarily hang a cat on Hunter Biden's words.
Well, I suspect it will run and run. That one, absolutely. Dr. Tom Packer, thank you so much indeed for joining us to talk about the latest updates on the health of President Joe Biden, which is absolutely important to us all. He is a fellow of the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford.